Do you find that most of the issues that people have with the supervisor are like flexible, fixable, or are they typically something that people walk into and you just have to suck it up and deal with it?
I am of the belief that when people say they have a difficult or a impossible manager, that 80% of the time, you think about the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time, it is very fixable things. And a lot of times it comes down to the fact that we are never given training about how to navigate human behavior in the workplace. We're told how to do our jobs well. We learn the systems, the technical skills around us, but nobody ever teaches us the psychological skills. And so there is a part of mastering our own psychology here, right? Getting over our own fears, insecurities, being able to stay grounded, composed, speak up for ourselves. But the other big missing piece is, how do you influence other people? And I don't mean influence in a sleazy Machiavellian way, but influence is about, how do you get your ideas and your opinion heard? How do you go from not being seen as a suck up, but being seen as more of a partner, a trusted advisor, someone who your boss, who respects you, values your opinion, brings opportunities to you?
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonppc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's ADYTONPBC.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're diving into the notebook of Melody Wilding, an executive coach and author of Managing Up: How to Get What You Need from the People in Charge. Now, out of all the leadership skills we develop, managing up is one of the most overlooked, yet one of the most important in the workplace. I've seen people who do this really well, and I've also watched both aspiring and seasoned leaders struggle with it, ultimately losing their seat at the table because they failed to navigate the relationships of those above them. In this interview, Melody breaks down the psychological skills that make all the difference: how to communicate effectively, setting boundaries, build trust with your boss in a way that benefits both you and the organization. Now, Melody has spent years coaching high performers, helping them understand the power dynamics of leadership and develop stronger and more productive relationships with those in charge. In this conversation, she presents a framework for having the right conversations at the right time. So you're not just following orders, but actively shaping your career. So if you want to lead as the best version of yourself and you want to manage up as the best version of yourself, grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Melody Wilding.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Melody, as we were talking right before we hit the record button, in the military, your boss has their position on their chest, in the form of rank, and so the power dynamics are a real thing for us. And we're trained, we're developed to follow orders, and not really to manage up. So, where I'd like to start with this is when you say managing up. What do you mean, and why is this such an important skill for people to develop?
Let's start with what I don't mean when I say managing up, which is being a suck up, a brown noser, just ingratiating yourself to your leaders. And it makes sense why we equate that with managing up, because if you think about how it's been depicted in movies or even in old school management books, and especially the culture of the military, right? It is just fall in line, do what you're told, don't ask questions. Your boss is your number one customer. You answer to them, and that's that. And that makes sense, again, why we've been brought up with this way. But today, even in the military, the culture has changed, it has developed. And when I say managing up now, how I define it is navigating your relationship with the people that have more positional power than you. And namely, that is your direct leader, your boss, your manager, whoever it may be. But it can also be broader than that. We can talk about that in a little bit too.
Well, do you find that most of the issues that people have with the supervisor are like flexible, fixable, or are they typically something that people walk into and you just have to suck it up and deal with it?
I am of the belief that when people say they have a difficult or a impossible manager, that 80% of the time, you think about the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time, it is very fixable things. And a lot of times it comes down to the fact that we are never given training about how to navigate human behavior in the workplace. We're told how to do our jobs well. We learn the systems, the technical skills around us, but nobody ever teaches us the psychological skills. And so there is a part of mastering our own psychology here, right? Getting over our own fears, insecurities, being able to stay grounded, composed, speak up for ourselves. But the other big missing piece is, how do you influence other people? And I don't mean influence in a sleazy Machiavellian way, but influence is about, how do you get your ideas and your opinion heard? How do you go from not being seen as a suck up, but being seen as more of a partner, a trusted advisor, someone who your boss, who respects you, values your opinion, brings opportunities to you?
And something that, reading your book, especially when you're talking about the importance of these relationships and the human dynamic, like you were just saying, like the human psychology of it all. It's something that I've experienced my own, and it was a conversation I had with Arthur Brooks on the podcast, and and I've said this several times, but I think it's so important, is that the leader of the organization, the commander, whoever it is the most objectified person in that organization, and people have a tendency to look at him or her not as a human being, but as their title and as their rank. And for me, prior to my last job taking command, I worked for 3 different senior leaders over the course of 4 years in the military. And what I found was that they were people just like everyone else and wanted to have conversations just like everyone else. And the people who were most successful dealing with them treated them as human beings and not as their rank and as their position.
Yes. And that, I hope a message that comes through with this book is that we need to cultivate upward empathy. Upward empathy does not mean that you accept or you necessarily condone what the person above you is doing, but it means you understand the context about why it's happening instead of blaming yourself, second guessing yourself, overthinking everything, thinking, well, I'm not cut out to be here and I can't handle this. Understanding that your manager being your leader being short with you or giving you unclear instructions may come from their pressures that they're facing, the stresses that they're under, the different demands that they're getting. And when you can understand that, again, you can approach the conversation much more objectively to say, help me understand. We don't have a clear direction on this initiative. Help me understand where that's coming from. There may be things here that I'm not aware of. Really saves you a lot of stress and frustration thinking like my boss just can't get it together. They're scattered, which is a dead end, versus acting more with greater curiosity to try to excavate what's really going on.
And that's what I thought was really interesting point. And I don't know if this was on purpose in your book, but these aren't like the book is the chapters, they're not 10 approaches to managing up. They're specific conversations, which is a back and forth dialogue. And I think that's a really important point in this. Again, going back to human nature and to empathy, is that we need to have conversations with the people we work for and not just make assumptions and live this existence where you're constantly under anxiety of, am I doing this right, am I doing this, did I make them mad, did I did I say something in the meeting that made her not want to work with me anymore, whatever. But the importance of having these conversations.
Absolutely. And, you were saying before about are these problems unfixable or is there room for improvement here? And that was what I discovered in my work over and over again, where people would say like, yeah, am I working on the right thing? I feel nervous about if I'm going to have a job here in a couple of weeks. And I would say, well, why don't you ask? Why don't you have a conversation about what priorities are and how you're aligning with that? And are you really working on the most important work, or how could you do that? What value could you offer? And so just having that dialogue, I mean, it sounds so simple, but often what's simple and obvious is not common practice. So yeah, to your point, the book is framed around 10 conversations. And part of that was a reaction to the fact that when you talk about managing up now, and even if you Google the topic, or I'm sure if any of your listeners have been in a training on this topic, you get sort of this piecemeal one-liner type advice like, be proactive, get in your boss's head, come with solutions, not problems. And that's nice, but it breaks down when the rubber hits the road because, okay, be proactive, but how? And how do I be proactive without stepping on toes and making my boss feel like I'm cutting them out of the process? And so in reality, managing up is much more nuanced because of the power dynamics involved. And it's not piecemeal. You need to think of this as more of a holistic career hygiene skill set. It's not just something you do in reaction to having a micromanager, for example. It's not just something you do as like an emergency toolkit. This should be a way you are always operating in your career, like a mindset and an attitude. And so it's not just this sort of scattered approach. And that's what I was hoping to really drive home for people, is that there's a process you can follow. And the book really starts with the most foundational conversations you need to have, and then works your way up as you build trust, rapport, credibility. You build your way up to some of the more advanced, maybe loaded conversations.
Well, before I jump into like the first conversation, the alignment conversation, I want to go back to something we said it a couple of times already, is empathy. Mm-hmm. And that is I'm curious with your clients, because that is something that, like what you see with your clients, because that's something for me, as I was a younger officer in the Army, I had zero empathy for the people I worked for. Like, they either got it or they didn't get it. Like they were either geniuses or idiots. And I didn't really understand all the pressures that they were under, and the fact that we're all learning simultaneously. Like the person in charge of me is also learning how to do their job. They may be a year or two ahead of me in their particular position, but they're still learning. And I didn't have empathy until I was in their shoes, and with tons of regrets on how I approach bosses, or how I thought about them and previously when I was younger. Do you find the same thing with your clients that you coach as well?
Oh yes, all the time. And again, it's a very human response. And I want to be very clear. Like nothing I'm saying excuses actual toxic behavior, abusive behavior. And when people do enter a leadership role, our expectations of them change. We do have this expectation that you are held to a higher standard because you are more of a representative of the organization and its values. And so that can be true. And it can also be true that bosses are imperfect people. Often people are promoted based on their technical skill or their past performance. And then when they get into a leadership role, what's required, it totally changes. No, it's no longer that you need to be good at the subject matter you were good at before. Now you need to be good at managing, wrangling people, managing different stakeholders and projects. What's required of you totally changes. And unfortunately, most leaders are just not ready for that. And they're scrambling through that. And of course, like you were saying, there's so many invisible pressures. I'm on the other side of the table with executives and leaders who are saying, I'm having to make really hard personnel decisions about potentially letting someone go or giving this person feedback on their personality that they might be offended with, but I have to protect the rest of the team. I'm trying to shield them from the leadership above me changing direction every month or every week. And so, yeah, again, we need to understand what they're going through. I'm not saying we just need to resign ourselves and accept that and say, give them a pass for bad behavior, quote unquote. But it helps you put their behavior in perspective and check your own emotional reaction when you're dealing with them.
Well, let's talk about the first conversation, the alignment conversation. Why is this the first chapter in the book, and why is this such an important conversation to have at some point with your boss?
Yeah, a few reasons. We start with alignment because you really can't go anywhere in your organization if you're not working on the right things. You are going to spin your wheels. You are going to get frustrated, feel sidelined, just feel like you're getting nowhere if you're doing the wrong work. And so I'm sure many, many people listening have had that feeling where you spend so much time and so much energy on a project only to find out, it's really not what the focus was in the end. And so we start with that alignment conversation for that reason. But also, it's one of the easier, lower stakes conversations to have because so much of it is about asking good questions and then listening for the response. It doesn't require, as many of the other later conversations do, it doesn't require you to be as assertive or forthcoming about your boundaries or what you want.
It's in something I've noticed too, just again, based on past experiences, is that everybody in the organization typically wants to do a great job. And a lot of times as leaders, we think we're communicating very clearly, but we're not. And, like as our message gets further and further away from our desk, and everybody below us is trying to do the right thing and move out and be action oriented, all of a sudden you have misalignment in the organization. And so, this is, I love this conversation because I feel like it's the people that are, below the leader taking agency over the issue and making sure that what they're doing is aligned with what the leader's intent is for that whatever team or large scale organization.
Yeah. And you hit on something really important there, that this is about you. And so, again, I think there's this misunderstanding about managing up, that it's something you do to benefit your manager and make them happy, when in reality, it's the exact opposite. Just like you said, this is really about you regaining a sense of agency, a feeling of control, a feeling that you can actually shape the relationships and the experience that you're having at work.
And like, I'll do a quick deep dive into this one.
Yeah.
One of the things real quick, if if you're listening to this conversation, you're like, oh, this book seems interesting. There's a lot of books out there that are very aspirational, that talk about abstract concepts. But this particular book, Managing Up, is like the equivalent for those in the military, is like a field manual with tips, tricks, like very practical tools, and even scripts. Oh man, that rhyme, that sounded really cheesy. But to do these things. And so, for an example, like if you're working for a control freak, what are some of the things that you can do? You've had the alignment conversation, you're tired, you're making sure you're in line with your boss's priorities. That's like step one. But then it's like every time you spend a week or 2 weeks working on something and you bring it back, it's wrong. Like, what are some things you could do there?
Yes. And I know we'll get into the second conversation, the styles conversation, in a bit, but I just want to loop back to that point about difficult bosses, because often what we perceive as difficult is a difference in styles. And so they're not necessarily difficult, they are different from you. And the control freak, the micromanager, can be a great example of that, because you may be dealing with a person that has a much higher information or control drive than you. And again, if we just deal with that reality as it is, we can flex our approach to save ourselves stress and have a better relationship with them. So if you are dealing with someone like that, one of my biggest suggestions is to really focus on bringing them rough drafts.
Yes.
Because what I see people do is that they will squirrel away, right? They'll squirrel away because they think, I have to make this perfect for my boss because I know they're going to criticize everything. So let me spend a lot of time, dotting the I's, crossing every T, going over it 100 times, and then I will present them this perfect document. And then they pick it apart and you feel terrible about yourself. So what I would suggest trying, if you've ever found yourself in that situation, is present them either your plan, your roadmap, or a rough draft. And you can go to them and say, this is my preliminary thinking. This is very rough around the edges. But before I go any further, is the core structure, are the main ideas correct here? Is how I am thinking about approaching this in line with what you're expecting, so that you don't go spend hours or a week only to be told, throw this out and start over again.
Yeah. And I'd like to share something. I don't know if a lot of people talk about this, but I would say that most bosses, when they give an assignment, don't really know what they want it to look like in the end. But when you show them something, they can tell you what they don't want it to be. And sometimes, and it goes back to like, if you squirrel away this thing till the 11th hour and then you show it, all you're doing is showing them one more thing they don't want. And that's why I love the rough draft iterative approach to this, because along the way, it allows, the person in charge to see it, like actually on paper or whatever it is, and then make iterative corrections along the way. And it saves you time, it saves them time, it saves the organization time. But I don't, like, for whatever reason, people wait till the very end to be like, surprise. And then it's not a good surprise at all. So I love that you wrote that in the book, because I've seen it happen on staffs of 10, 15 people to organizations of 30, 40, 50,000 people. And it is it's always the same thing. Like, if you just would have iterated on it, you would have had a much easier time.
Yeah. And I think part of it comes from fear that if I bring my boss this half-baked thing, they're going to judge it. And I get that. But also, your boss again, you have to know who you're dealing with. This is where the psychology portion comes in. If you're dealing with someone that has a higher drive for control and involvement, then they're going to feel safer being involved earlier in the process, versus if you wait, there's all that time where they're wondering, are they actually working on it? Is it going to be any good? I don't know if they actually listen to my instructions on this. And so that's where, again, knowing who you're dealing with. You said something very important, though, about presenting trade-offs or presenting something that the leader can react to. And if people take away anything from this conversation today, I want it to be the fact that to be successful at managing up, a core part of it is how can you save your leaders cognitive energy? How can you take some of the mental heavy lifting off of them? They will love you for that. And you will get to shape, to drive the idea, the narrative, the deliverable, because you're the one presenting an idea that they can react to. And so whether it is something like getting ahead of a micromanager, it's coming with a proposal that they just have to say yes or no to, look for ways you can save them cognitive energy and you will be golden.
A couple more points and then we'll move on to the styles.
Yeah.
Because the other thing that we're really bad about in the Army across the board is prioritization. Like I think I read somewhere that the word priority was singular up until the 20th century or the 19th century, something like that. But like essentially we are very bad at focusing our efforts and energy in our organization, or we're constantly shifting back and forth. Like we would have like the priorities of the week, just because things were happening so quickly. So again, having a conversation to make sure you're aligned is another great way to keep your seat at the table, because I've seen it happen before. Is the boss's focus completely shifted to something else, and people are still working on like 5 projects back and have not played catch up yet.
Well, you have to have the courage to call out that inconsistency, right? To say to your leader, hey, in our last meeting, we had talked about that this was going to be the priority. Now I'm hearing we're shifting to this other thing. Is that correct? Am I off base here? What would you like me to adjust? And notice I'm not saying that with a attitude or entitlement or anger to my voice. Again, it's more about curiosity, because leaders depend on the people below them to surface that kind of information, because they don't always have line of sight into that anymore. They're operating at a different level and they may not even be aware. And so I think also changing your frame, that actually that's a service you can offer your leader, to call that out before it becomes a risk. That's huge.
And I want to highlight how you just asked that. That's another important thing. I've been the person that shifted priorities in an organization, and somebody came in the office very heated and was like, what are we doing? I don't understand. Like it was very accusatory. And what I found in those instances, like, is self-aware as I am, my defenses completely shot up, and we quit having a good conversation after that. So I think it's really important to like frame it in such a way that the supervisor, the leader, whatever, like their like defense dome just doesn't deploy, and all of a sudden like you're not having a good conversation anymore. All right, I have to tell you about fight camp. Staying physically fit has always been a priority for me, but after 20 years in the military, my knees just can't handle high impact workouts like CrossFit or long distance running anymore, and I refuse to sit still on a Peloton. That's where fight camp comes in. It's the largest boxing and kickboxing training community in the world, and it's been a total game changer for me. Even though I've never boxed a day in my life, fight camp made it easy to jump in. The system includes punch trackers that measure speed, volume, and output in real time, so I can actually see my progress with every session that I do in the comfort of my garage. And boxing and kickboxing are proven to help manage PTSD, anxiety, depression, and stress. There's something incredibly therapeutic about throwing punches and getting in the zone. Every session ends with a focused 6 to 8 minute core workout, So I walk away feeling stronger, both physically and mentally. Now, whether you're a complete beginner or an experienced fighter, Fight Camp has you covered. Their app offers over 3,000 workouts tailored to different skill levels and training goals. That means you'll never run out of fresh challenges and can train at your own pace whenever and wherever works for you. And the best part, my kids love it too. Fight Camp has gloves that even fit my 7-year-old daughter, making it a fun and healthy way for the whole family to stay active together. Right now, Fight Camp is offering an exclusive deal for From the Green Notebook listeners. You'll get this free Fight Camp package, including punch trackers, quick wraps, and a 45-day membership trial to the Fight Camp app. That's a $278 value. And they're even covering shipping and taxes. There's no contract and you can cancel anytime. If you've ever wanted to try boxing or kickboxing from the comfort of your home, now is the perfect time. So check out our show notes, check out the website. You can get information there and take advantage of this From the Green Notebook package for Fight Camp exclusively for our listeners. I want to go now to styles because we keep touching on it. And I think this is very important because I have worked with people and our styles were completely different. And I immediately went to this person's toxic was my go-to with that. So let's talk about styles a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to want to dig into that situation in a minute, though.
All right.
But yes, when we talk about styles, exactly to your point that we misinterpret people's behavior, we then label them, we shut down, and likewise, I've had so many clients. I actually start the book with the story of one of my clients who was told by her manager, I don't know if you're incompetent or you're scattered or both. And it was because of their difference in styles that he was extremely bottom line oriented, big military idea, right? Bluff, bottom line up front. And she was much more focused on context and process and understanding the story of how we got here and the people involved. And he didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to know what was the action you needed from me. And so because they were talking past each other, there was just so much friction in their relationship. And that's what happens when we don't understand this. And in that chapter, I present what's a simplified framework of people's communication styles. Of course, reality is much more complex, but if we boil things down, we can map people's styles on two basic dimensions. So we have dominance, how much they like to control, assert themselves, feel a sense of power and momentum in a situation. And then we have sociability. So how emotionally expressive are they? How much are they inclined to interact with and incorporate other people into their plans? And so when you map those on an axis, you get 4 different styles. And to make it simple to remember, I call those the 4 C's. We have the commander, the cheerleader, the caretaker, and the controller.
And what I found about this, my experience, I did something when I was a commander. We did insights discovery. We brought a group in called PZI who administered this test, and everybody got like this 29-page report of their style, how they communicate, how they take in information in my core team. And what I found was, because I was the new guy on that team, what I found that there were so many conflicts before I got there because there were so many misunderstandings and people were taking things personally because it wasn't a style thing. It was a, personally insulting thing, the way that people communicated. And once I think we figured out like who I was, who they were, as individuals, we were actually able to come together as a team and work together and also complement each other's strengths and weaknesses because we could see it in paper instead of just assuming things.
Exactly. It's like having an operating manual for people as they are, as workers and humans. And it's so helpful because none of this requires you to be a chameleon and just totally give up who you are just to be more like someone else. That's not what we're saying here. It's small adjustments. So for example, if you know, let's take the caretaker personality. I have to imagine there's some of those in the military. The caretaker personality is very people oriented, tends to have a very warm personality. Their main motivation is making sure that there's stability and that people are happy, everything's copacetic. That's their main drive. Downside of that is they may really be afraid to offer a viewpoint. They may be shy about offering feedback or just totally avoid conflict. And so if you're trying to persuade or convince a caretaker to take action, you're going to want to frame your message around how does this help us achieve greater stability or improve morale in the organization. And if you're trying to influence someone who's more of a cheerleader, they're still high on sociability, but they're also higher on dominance. So they tend to move faster, they have bigger ideas, much more energetic than the caretaker. The cheerleader is going to care more and wants to hear more about words like vision, opportunities. And so even just making those small tweaks to your language, to how you frame things, means that at the end of the day, your message is going to get through more. It's going to be more respected, again, which ultimately benefits you and everyone.
Well, I want to talk, this is a very important skill, again, understanding your boss's style and then meeting them, I'd say like maybe halfway or a lot closer to where they're at than where you're at. But talk about the me manual. I thought this was really important because it for me, this comes back to self-awareness, which a lot of people lack. And then they end up like just shooting arrows at their boss. Like their boss is the one messed up, not them. Or like it's not a relationship thing. It's just like it's not a style mismatch. It's this boss is just a horrible person mismatch or whatever.
Right. And this job is not a fit for me. Yeah. I need to leave. Yeah, exactly. So your me manual is your operating manual to yourself. This does not have to be something you necessarily share with others. It can. We can talk about how you might do that. But like you were saying, you have to understand your own inner workings before you can deal with others. And so your me manual, it's a process. It can be just a simple one-pager or a journaling exercise that you do one day. But the important thing is to look at what is your own work style. So specific things like hot button areas where we tend to clash the most are things like information processing. Do you tend to understand things better through visuals, numbers? Are you more of a spoken person? When you make decisions, how do you make decisions? Do you rely more on your gut feeling, on data analysis? Do you prefer to receive information in advance? Are you okay with more spontaneous, off the cuff idea generation? So information processing is one area. There's also task management. How do you like to manage your time and feel a sense of control about what's going on around you? Are you someone that likes more kind of startup kind of feel? So you're working on shorter term projects where you're getting them off the ground and then you're done with them? Or are you kind of the slow and steady, more long-term person? Do you like projects where you can just deep dive into one thing or be sort of a master of different areas? And then your work environment, your schedule. When do you start work, end work? How much interaction do you want to have with people on a day-to-day basis? How often do you need like protected time for deep work? What times of day are you most productive and open to interacting with people versus not? Feedback and conflict. This is a huge one that people often overlook. So I think we all make the assumption that some of us, if you're going to give me feedback, do it in private, do it face to face. Not everyone is like that. I've talked to a lot of people who would say, if I'm presenting during a meeting and you see me doing something that's not landing well, message me and let me know so I can pivot on the spot. And so how do you like to receive or feedback rather? Do you want it periodically? Like, do you want a formal sit down? Do you want it more on a as it comes basis? And one of my favorite questions to ask and even put out there for your leader is, we are going to disagree at some point. Like, let's just face that, we're going to have differences. How do we want to handle that when that happens? It's such a great question to ask. Just put the elephant out there on the table, and then at least you have some agreements to come back to in the end.
And this, I love this so much, Melody, because people will go, and I'm sure you've seen this in the corporate world, people will go their entire professional careers and they can't answer any of these questions about themselves. They may be able to answer some, they may have an idea, but to actually take the time to write it down. A couple of years ago, my friend Cassie Crosby and I, we published something called My Green Notebook, Know Thyself Before Changing Jobs. And it's a book that you can take and for 30 days after you change a job. And it's awesome. I love this part of your book because those same similar questions, we ask those, and you could just write it down. It's 2 questions a day for 30 days. But at the end of it, you essentially have your me manual of the things you learned about yourself from that past job. And then now you can go to your next job and say, hey, this is who I am. How can we work together to best support the organization? And because like the insights discovery tool I used, I have found that we just have to, it's like in the military, we only get like 2 years together a lot of times, and then people move on. But we spend 2 years like fumbling around in the dark, and we don't realize we're stepping on each other's toes and fingers until it actually happens. And so for you as a person climbing the organization, to take the time to develop your me manual is something that's going to help not just you out, but your boss out. And I can't imagine how many conflicts in organizations, if you knew these things about yourself, you would completely avoid.
100%. Yeah. And, I'm a big believer that you teach people how to treat you. And what you were saying about being able to come into a role, and you can do this even if you've been in a role for a while. You can use the start of a year, the start of a new quarter, whatever it is, to say, hey, I've been thinking about how we can work successfully together. And you can start by asking the other person, I would love to understand a few of these things about you. When I share project updates, what's the best way you want me to do that? If I need some quick feedback on XYZ, how do you want me to get that from you? When we disagree, how do you want to handle that? That gives you an opening to then say, thanks so much for sharing that. From my end, here's what would be helpful. And I interviewed dozens and dozens of people for this book. I surveyed over 12,000 people. And some of the comments I got back about this chapter were the most meaningful, as you were saying, that people say, I want people to tell me how to manage them. Goes back to that idea of take the cognitive burden off of them. Tell your leader how to get the best performance out of you.
I think, for the sake of time, we've got one more, and I'm struggling because I'm looking at the ownership conversation, the boundaries conversation, the feedback. But I think I want to go with boundaries because I feel like this is one area that I know, at least for myself, I felt like I was trained in the military to not have any boundaries, and it doesn't go well. And so I think this is a really important conversation to have. And so I'll begin with the first question is, how do you know that one of your boundaries is being stepped on?
In my first book, Trust Yourself, I sketched out this test you can do. And I'll make it really simple for people. If you have a feeling of resentment, that is usually a very, very strong emotional signal that you need to set boundaries, that a value of yours has been crossed, that you've let a situation go on too long without addressing it, you feel taken advantage of in a situation. So resentment, listening to our emotions, can actually be a powerful signal of where we need to take action.
So resentment, I'll throw some other ones out there.
Yeah,
frustration.
please. Yep.
like just getting like frustrated, feeling anxious is another one. Like, why am I coming in, to work with anxiety today? And the reason I think it's important to recognize that within ourselves is that's an internal feeling that as your boss, I may not recognize in you. And because I have an organization to run with goals to accomplish, I will continue to push until I know that, because in my mind, everything's kosher. But in your mind, it's not kosher at all. And what eventually happen is I'll either burn you out or you will end up hating me, hating the organization. And I would argue that most people, and I'm curious what you've seen too, is if somebody were to sit down and say, "Hey, here's a boundary that I have," because could we talk about that? Would be receptive to it, right?
Most of the time. I think it's about delivery, right?
Okay.
And there's this phrase that no is a complete sentence. In most aspects of life, that is completely and totally true. In the workplace, not so much, because I'm sure, the person listening could imagine going to your officer, your leader, and saying, "No, I'm not going to do that." Like it just would not go over.
No, it wouldn't.
And so we have to be much more tactful about how we deliver our boundaries. And really, the best way to think about it is, how can you deliver your boundary in a way that you show what's in it for them? An example might be, if I work with a lot of people that do want time to think before they have to speak up. And so a boundary you might set is, "Hey, I would really love to get questions 24 hours ahead of our meeting so that I can prepare, I can come with the best thoughts possible, and we can make that time more efficient and maybe even get out, make that meeting even faster for you." So you're saying, here's how this request I have actually serves you and helps you in the end. Or let's say you've been given an impossible deadline on something. You may say, "Hey, I would love to revisit that. I want to understand, number one, what's the urgency driving that? That may help you unearth like some of those hidden priorities or pressures. But number two, could we work together to adjust the scope or the timeline here? Because what I don't want to happen is that if we're rushing, we make mistakes, and then that makes us look bad, or the customer is upset, or whatever." Again, what's in it for them at the end of the day? And so that makes it, approaching it that way, number one, everybody's favorite topic is themselves. But number two, it makes you seem more like a team player, because you're not just saying flat out no, you're trying to work to find a solution, a compromise that's going to be a win-win for both of you.
Yeah, and like, there's one that is really bad in the military, because we're a boundaryless organization, is like texting and phone calls after hours.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a commander, I had to tell my team, like, listen, don't ask me questions. Like, I'm here at work till this time. Feel free to hit me up, before I leave. But once I leave, like, leave me alone. And I didn't say it like that, but I was like, I need time with my family to recharge in the evenings
Mm-hmm.
so that I can come back the next day completely like ready to tackle the day. But if like work is following me home, as the leader, and I'm like still cognitively at work because I'm getting text messages, I'm getting, angry over hearing something, whatever, then I can, then I'm not going to show up as my best self the next day. But then also making the statement of, hey, I like, if there was an emergency, then like, please, by all means, let me know. But otherwise, like, let's just hold off until the next day. And so I like, that's just an example of a conversation having down, but explaining like the why behind it instead of just the, nope, this is my rule.
Yeah. And this is where the conversations start to interconnect, because that, expectation or that boundary around like, hey, I end at work at this time and then I'm with my family. That could be something that comes up when you're sharing parts of your me manual around your work schedule and your hours. And then that way, when you actually do set a boundary, you can say, if you remember earlier in the year, we talked about how at 6 p.m. I take off. I am with my family during that time. And so you do have to know your culture here. I work with a lot of people that are in always on type cultures, whether it's like crisis communication or advertising or something like that. And you may have to make some compromises to say, when you receive something, to say, got it, we'll take care of this first thing in the morning, just because there's an expectation in that culture of acknowledgement and that you're on top of it, or just received, thank you. And so you do have to know where you're operating. But the other wise thing I thought you said was defining what qualifies as an emergency. Because if the people around you don't understand those escalation patterns, then their own incentive is everything's an emergency because I want it done now.
Yeah.
But if you can say, for these types of requests, email me, call me if this happens. And so you can kind of triage things that way too.
And going to this constant theme of it's a human business, pushback power.
Yeah.
Understanding where you sit in the organization, the culture of the organization, and how you can push back when you find yourself in a boundary situation. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I've never heard this before. So I thought this is true. This is stuff that we see, but I've never actually seen it in writing before.
Right. And that was part of my goal with this book, was to take the invisible and make it more visible and tangible for us. And the concept of pushback power, we need to think about when we should say no. So there are certain situations, you may not want to say no to because it's an opportunity for you. It's exposure. If you say yes, you're building relational capital with the other person. So you have to know when you should say no, but also can you say no? And specifically, with what strength can you say no? And so pushback power is really it really revolves around power dynamics. And so there's different dimensions to this. Your pushback power is on the higher end if you have been at the organization a long time. You are in a higher rank, you're in a more senior role. You have skills that are not readily replaceable. Your relationship with your boss is strong. They see you more as that partner. They trust and value your input. They seek out your ideas. Your boss's management style is they are aware of the goings on in the team and people's bandwidth. They have a history of being amenable to these types of requests. The organization that you're in, also has a culture of caring about people's sustainability. So all of those things point to you have higher leverage to set boundaries. Whereas if you have a lower pushback power, basically the opposite of those things. Have you only been in this organization a short time, so you don't have capital built out? Is the company in crisis mode? Is your boss really the sort of driver, pace setter type, doesn't really care where people's bandwidth is at, just get it done? If you have lower pushback power, that doesn't mean you just flat out can't set boundaries, but you have to be a bit more softer and maybe a bit more deferential in how you set boundaries. One of the tactics I mentioned in the book for doing that is giving a conditional yes. And so you may say, I understand this is urgent. It's a priority for the team. So I'm happy to take this on one time, or I'm happy to take this on for the next quarter. But at the end of that, I would love to set a meeting now to revisit and see if we can adjust the scope or if this could be delegated to another team at that point. When you have lower pushback power, you may have to make those types of concessions.
And the self-awareness is in reading the room is so important in that, Melody. Like, I've watched people who have dropped the ball on, 5 consecutive tasks, and then they come in with like thinking their pushback power is like to the ceiling, and immediately, like almost like reactionary. I'm like, no, you're not. I'm not giving you this time off. Whereas I've, watched people who are able to manage their relationships very well, that are the folks on the team who are constantly showing up, constantly hitting home runs, the folks you can always rely on. Like, I've given people like that a lot more leeway very easily. But what I've noticed is it's more often than not, it's the people who have zero pushback power that try to come in with all the thunder. And I feel like if they understood themselves and where they sat a little bit better, that they could get their goal across the line, but they're like their own worst enemy in those instances. And I've been that person too, at times in my career. But I love that is an emphasis in this section of the book.
Yeah, I think we've all been there, unfortunately.
Well, Melody, I know like we're coming up on time, and this was the first book I've read of yours, and I know you have several out there. So, for folks interested in learning more about you and more about your work, where can they find you? And then could you just talk about some of your other books? Because in my research for this podcast, I was like, I should have been reading your stuff way earlier on.
Yes, my first book is called Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking, and Channel Your Emotions for Success. And if you are interested in the managing your own psychology part of it, your own insecurities and doubts, that is the book for you. Specifically, it is really geared towards people who consider themselves to be highly sensitive. I don't mean fragile. I do mean being a deep thinker and feeler, and you're pointing at yourself. Yeah. And thank you for also saying like those people can exist in any type of organization, in any industry. Yes. I think that's really important. So that's my first book. And this new book, Managing Up, really came out of Trust Yourself, because people would say, okay, I feel more insecure, or rather, I feel more secure with myself now. I feel more confident, but I don't know how to deal with people in authority. That's where everything breaks down. And so that's where Managing Up comes in. And you can find information about both books at melodywilding.com. If you're interested in Managing Up specifically, managingup.com is the place for that, but they're both available wherever books are sold.
Awesome. And then are you still doing executive coaching too?
I have a team that supports me with executive coaching now, but we do offer group programs. I'm also really, really active on LinkedIn. I have a ton of courses there. So folks can find me over there, message me. I always love hearing what people took away from the conversations.
Awesome. Well, Melody, thank you so much for your time today. Best of luck on Managing Up. Like I said, I think this book is going to help so many people, because this is definitely a blind spot that so many folks I've worked with have. I've had it at times. And so I think just understanding how to do this a little bit better will just not only help them out, the listeners out, but also help the organizations at large out too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email, where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself. I came from the mud. There's